Good evening. The name of my presentation is the JFK Medical Coverup, Events at Bethesda Naval Hospital on November 22nd, 1963. Now, I provided you with a summary slide indicating that there have been 6 JFK medical inquiries since the assassination in 1963. The first, of course, was the Warren Commission, impaneled very late in 1963. They did almost all of their work in 1964 and published in September of 64. Next came a rather strange report signed in January 1967. I've always called it the military review because the 3 military pathologists who did JFK's autopsy are the people who signed it. And yet they were called together by the Justice Department. And it appears that the Justice Department actually wrote the report, or large segments of it, and then the doctors simply signed it as directed. The purpose of this report was to marry up the autopsy photographs and X-rays, which had not been cataloged officially until November 1966, to marry them up with the autopsy report written in 1963. Now, Attorney General Ramsey Clark convened a review panel of the medical evidence in 1968. In 1975, there was a one-man review of the medical evidence by Dr. Werner Spitz of the Rockefeller Commission staff. Now, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the HSCA, performed a major reinvestigation of the medical evidence. They were in business from 1976 through 1978 and published their work in 1979. The Assassination Records Review Board, the ARRB, was in business for 4 years, from 1994 to 1998. And I was a member of the staff of that body. I was hired to work on the military records team and was later promoted to head the military records team. You need to understand that formal reinvestigation of the JFK assassination was not permitted by Congress in the JFK Records Act. The Congress wanted the review board to locate and to declassify to the maximum extent possible all records reasonably related to the JFK assassination. But as I say, they did not authorize reinvestigation. They did not desire that. Nevertheless, the review board staff did conduct a lot of what I would call extra credit work in the medical evidence arena. Why? Because Congressman Lewis Stokes from Cleveland, Ohio, who formerly had chaired the HSCA in the 1970s. Congressman Stokes met with the 5 board members in 1993, shortly before the ARRB was impaneled, and admitted to them that very few people, if any, were satisfied with the work of the HSCA in the medical evidence field. He strongly encouraged the board members to do all they could to clarify the record in the area of the medical evidence, and they listened to his request. The review board staff conducted many unsworn medical interviews and also conducted 10 depositions of persons present at or associated with the autopsy on President Kennedy. They also conducted 1 deposition of a group of Dallas treating physicians. So there are a total of 11 deposition transcripts that were placed in the National Archives in 1998, along with the interview reports of all of our unsworn witnesses. They were placed in the archives without comment because, I remind you, the review board was not allowed to reinvestigate, which means they were not allowed to come up with findings of fact in regard to what happened. So those items are in the archives for the American people to study and decide for themselves what they mean. And in a sense, that's what this presentation is all about. It's an attempt to explain to you the significant ways that the medical evidentiary landscape has changed since the work of the ARRB was completed. There's been one really seminal article published, I think, about the 5 investigations that met before the review board went into business. It was published in 2003 by Dr. Gary Aguilar and his colleague Kathleen Cunningham. It was titled, How 5 Investigations into JFK's Autopsy and Medical Evidence Got It Wrong. I would highly recommend it to anyone who wants to understand the history of these investigations and how they built on each other, how they differed from each other, and how the interpretation of the conflicted evidence has evolved over time. Now, it will soon become apparent that I've pursued a certain methodology in building this presentation. My primary focus has been on these elements. Chain of custody and timelines. I repeat, chain of custody and timelines. Who saw what and when? And who did what and when? I examined and analyzed descriptions before and after major changes were noted in President Kennedy's wounds. I do that to determine what happened during crucial events by comparing these changes in his wounds seen by different people at different times on November 22nd. In short, I believe I'm following basic police investigative procedure. Now, the tools used have included the bootleg autopsy photos. There are 2 collections, one black and white, one color, and 2 skull X-ray images published by the HSCA in black and white on paper. If you want to know more about the bootleg autopsy photos, we can do that during the Q&A following this presentation. We need to rely on those because the Kennedy family will not allow anyone to reproduce the original images in the National Archives. So we're fortunate that we have 2 bootleg collections. And having seen the collection 16 times myself on different occasions, I can tell you that all of the bootleg autopsy photos that I'll be showing you do depict what's in the archives. It's just that some of them are a little bit cropped. Some of the borders are cut off, and that some of them suffer from a contrast buildup. But they are accurate depictions in general of what's in the archives. There are 52 postmortem photographs overall, 25 black and white negatives, and 27 color positive transparency. They're all 4" by 5" in size, 4 by 5 inches, large format film. Of these, only 38 are of JFK's body, and 14 are images of a brain. I've relied on official reports, some written by the FBI, the U.S. Marine Corps, the autopsy report itself, of course, the casket team, Gawler's funeral home, and there's even one memo from CBS News that I've relied upon. Witness recollections are crucial, as recorded in doctors' treatment notes, autopsy notes, unsworn interviews, and sworn testimony. And the sworn testimony comes from 3 sources: the Warren Commission, the HSCA, and the ARRB. Now, to understand Bethesda, you must begin in Dallas with what was seen at Parkland Hospital. At Parkland, the medical staff attempted to save JFK's life with emergency treatment. An autopsy was not performed. Only 2 wounds were directly observed by the treatment staff at Parkland: a small penetrating entrance wound in the throat and a blowout widely interpreted as an exit wound in the right rear of the head. Now let's return to the entrance wound in the throat. It was about the width of a pencil, just below the larynx or Adam's apple, but above the shirt collar and just to the right of the midline. The best witnesses to this were Dr. Carrico, the first doctor to see President Kennedy in Trauma Room 1, and Dr. Perry, the man who performed the tracheotomy on his throat to help him breathe. Dr. Carrico, in his treatment notes, called it a small penetrating wound, indicating that it was pushed inward from the outside to the inside, as if it were an entry wound, and it was small and round and not large and jagged. When he was interviewed by Harold Weisberg for Harold Weisberg's book, Post-Mortem, Carrico confirmed that, yes, the wound was above the top edge of the shirt collar. Dr. Perry appeared at a post-death press conference along with his colleague, Dr. Kemp Clark, on November 22nd in the afternoon. Dr. Perry stated that the wound in the throat was an entry coming from the front 3 different times in the Parkland press conference. The videotapes of that press conference, which went out on national television, were confiscated shortly afterward by the U.S. Secret Service. However, we do have a verbatim record of what these 2 men said. It exists in White House transcript 1327C, which was recorded by a White House staffer and is now readily available online. A blowout, widely interpreted as an exit wound in the right rear of the head, was about the size of a baseball or a small orange. Terms used by the treating physicians were occipital parietal and occipital temporal. Soon we'll be looking at drawings from anatomy textbooks and skull models to help you understand what these terms mean. What does occipital parietal mean and what does occipital temporal mean, and is there much of a difference between the two? Now, both wounds implied shots from the front, which was in complete opposition to what later became the official story of a shooter firing from above and behind the Texas School Book Depository. This is Nurse Audrey Bell's wound diagram that she made for the ARRB in 1997. She was the chief operating room nurse at Parkland Hospital, and she observed President Kennedy's treatment for about 5 minutes in Trauma Room 1 before she went off to assist with Governor Connolly's wounds. As you can see, the wound she recalls on President Kennedy's head was in the lower right rear of his head. This diagram from Grant's Anatomy shows that the occipital bone is squarely in the back of your head. It's where you would lay your head on the pillow. Above and to the right of it is the right parietal bone. Above and to the left of the occipital bone is the left parietal bone. The occipital bone separated from the parietal bones by the lambdoid suture, and the parietal bones are separated by the sagittal suture. So Nurse Bell's recollection was of a wound that was entirely occipital. This diagram depicts Dr. Charles Crenshaw's wound diagram that he made for us in 1997. His wound is a little bit higher than Audrey Bell's. It's occipital and slightly parietal. It's still in the rear of the head. It's still in the right rear of the head. He was the 3rd-year resident who was in Trauma Room 1 for the entire treatment period. He administered the cut down on the president's right leg, providing intravenous fluids for the president. Now, here are the medical procedures performed in Dallas. It's important that we understand what was done and what was not done. A tracheotomy was performed by Dr. Perry to assist with breathing. Remember, the president had a bullet entry wound in his throat, and there was a lot of blood inside his trachea, and the airway was blocked. So a small lateral incision was made through the bullet wound in the throat, which was only 2.5 to 3 centimeters wide. But keep in mind how small this is. 1 inch equals 2.54 centimeters. So this incision was only a little bit more than 1 inch wide. Excuse me. A breathing tube was inserted inside the incision, It had two flanges on it, one on the inside, one on the outside, to hold it in place, and a breathing machine performed respiration artificially. No surgery was performed on JFK's skull. Closed chest massage and intravenous injection of fluids were performed in the right ankle and the left arm. Now, these fluids were initially Ringer's lactate and later type O, pH negative blood, and hydrocortisone. Dr. Clark said at the post-death press conference that JFK was treated for approximately 40 minutes. It's unclear whether this is precisely true or whether he was exaggerating. And the reason we're not sure is that the official time of death was recorded on the Dulles death certificate as 1:00 p.m. Now, this was possibly backdated by as much as 20 minutes if Dr. Clark was correct, because JFK arrived outside the hospital at 12:38, according to admission records, and in Trauma Room 1 at 12:43, according to Dr. Clark's treatment notes. In any case, for all practical purposes, JFK was essentially dead on arrival. He had slow agonal respiration. He was cyanotic, that means he was turning blue. He had no pulse, no blood pressure, no electrocardial activity, and approximately 1/3 of the brain was missing. This was an estimate made later for the Warren Commission by Dr. McClelland. Now, I want you to remember this observation. It's crucial to understanding where the head wound really was. Cerebellar tissue from the cerebellum, was seen extruding from the head wound and falling out onto the treatment cart by Doctors Clark, Jenkins, and McClelland. Doctors Clark and Jenkins wrote about this in their typed treatment notes from November 22nd. Dr. McClelland gave a vivid description of this to the Warren Commission in the spring of 1964. Kemp Clark was the head of neurosurgery and the man who pronounced President Kennedy dead, and he reliably reported both cerebral and cerebellar tissue extruding from JFK's head wound. Dr. McClelland testified in 1964 that he saw cerebellar brain tissue from the right cerebellum, falling out of the head and onto the treatment cart, and that, in his estimation, about 1/3 of the brain was missing posteriorly in the back. The breathing tube was removed after death, and the small tracheotomy incision closed of its own volition. No photos were taken inside Trauma Room 1 at Parkland Hospital. Now, I want you to note the location of the cerebellum on the left in the photo below. The cerebellum is red in the model that you see on the left. The cerebrum is painted blue-gray. So most of the surface of your brain is the cerebrum. The cerebellum is a totally separate section of the brain with very different type of tissue located below the cerebrum in the lower back of your head. Now, the location of the cerebellum on the human body is entirely consistent with the wound diagrams made by Audrey Bell and Charles Crenshaw, which show a wound low in the right rear of the head, or at the most midway up the right rear of the head. They're entirely consistent with each other. The model in the middle shows the occipital bone in red. You can see it squarely in the back of your head. And the right parietal bone is painted light gray. So, and below the right parietal bone is in pink is the right temporal bone, which surrounds the ear, forward and behind the auditory canal. So you can see that a description of a rear head wound that was occipital parietal is not very much different from a description that's occipital temporal. An occipital temporal wound would be just a little bit lower in the right rear of the head than an occipital parietal wound, and the descriptions used both terminologies. And the skull just to the right of the middle, you'll see that there's a hole in the back of the head, and you can see the blue-gray cerebral tissue and part of the red cerebellum. Now, this is the exact size of the exit defect that Dr. Carrico gave to it in his Warren Commission testimony in the spring of 1964. Remember, the president's lying on his back, and brain tissue, both cerebral and cerebellar, are extruding from this wound as he's lying on his back and falling out onto the treatment car. Now, Dr. Boswell, one of the three military pathologists, was asked to draw on a skull model during his deposition. We'll be examining that sketch later. We wanted him to draw the extent of the missing bone in President Kennedy's head. So when he looked at the skull model, which was identical to this one, he told us that President Kennedy's skull was larger than this, and that this skull model was smaller than President Kennedy's cranium. So my point here is that although I've drawn the exact size of the exit wound in the back of the head, proportionately on President Kennedy's head, it would have appeared smaller because President Kennedy's head was bigger than this skull model. We'll discuss the skull on the right and what it depicts at a later time in this lecture. Now, there was an important bone fragment found in Dealey Plaza on Saturday, November 23rd, 1963. It was found by Billy Harper, a pre-med student, and therefore became known as the Harper fragment. He took it to his uncle, a pathologist, Jack Harper, and Jack Harper shared it with two of his pathologist colleagues at the hospital where he worked in Dallas. Those colleagues were Dr. Cairns, the head of pathology, and then Jack Harper, and then his colleague, Gerald Noteboom. Fortunately, they followed correct procedure and photographed the bone fragment. They confirmed that it was human skull bone. They said it was reasonably fresh. Blood was fresh on the bone fragment. You can see from these two photographs reproduced by the HSCA that it's a little bit more than 2.5 inches wide. On the left, you see the exterior surface. On the right, the interior surface. Now, this skull fragment has disappeared, unfortunately. So all we have are these photographs that were taken in 1963, and I believe one X-ray taken of the fragment. The FBI held on to these photographs and to this X-ray of the fragment for years and didn't do anything improper. They held on to the evidence, and you can see them today in the National Archives if you make a request. The House Select Committee didn't want this to be occipital bone from the back of the head because they didn't want to believe that there was a hole in the back of the head. They deferred to the autopsy photographs, which show no such hole, and therefore they decided the Harper fragment was from the right parietal region, the right side of the head. But they never held the bone in their hands and examined it in person like Cairns, Harper, and Noteboom. So I defer to the three doctors who held the bone in their hands. The FBI reports of the interviews of these men survive today, and the HSCA staff interviewed Dr. Cairns in the late 70s, and he was insistent that it was occipital bone. Now, the transportation of JFK's body from Parkland in Dallas to Bethesda in Maryland is an important subject. Let's discuss how the body was wrapped before it left Dallas. JFK was wrapped in two sheets, one around the body, another around the head. No zippered body bag was used at Parkland Hospital. I make this point because later JFK was removed from a zippered body bag at Bethesda. But everyone at Parkland Hospital is unanimous in that no zippered body bag was used at Parkland Hospital. A plastic mattress cover was used, but only to line the interior of the casket. JFK's body was placed on top of the mattress cover, not inside it. The casket he was placed into was ornate, heavy, all metal, and bronze. It was a viewing coffin. It was a very heavy, dark brown metal viewing casket, and it weighed over 400 pounds empty. There was a serious altercation at Parkland Hospital between the Dallas County coroner, Dr. Earl Rose, and the U.S. Secret Service as the Secret Service absconded with the president's body. Dr. Rose valiantly insisted on a Texas autopsy, which was required by Texas law. The Secret Service refused permission for him to do this and ended up removing the body by force after a violent and profane argument ensued and guns were drawn. Now imagine this, the president's casket was on top of a church truck, a wheeled conveyance used to move caskets. The president's widow was walking alongside of it. The church truck is being pushed by Secret Service agents. Dr. Rose stands in the door and refuses to let them leave. He says he has to do a Texas autopsy by law. And they inform him, after considerable use of profanity and threats, that if he didn't get out of the way, he would be run over by the casket. You can see this recollection by Dr. Peters in the documentary, The Men Who Killed Kennedy. Ambulance driver Aubrey Reich has spoken eloquently of how frightened he was and at the extreme level of profanity used and disrespect in the presence of the president's widow. The president was removed eventually because they shoved Dr. Rose up against the wall, pulled their coats aside, and showed their handguns in their holsters. One witness even recalled one Secret Service agent pulling out a semi-automatic weapon and brandishing it in the air. So they got away with the body. Of course, the body was bound for Air Force One. Aubrey Reich was the ambulance driver. He helped place President Kennedy in the bronze casket. He felt the sharp bone extruding from the back of his head through the sheet around President Kennedy's head. He could feel that sharp bone as he helped place him in the casket. He said it was so sharp it almost cut his fingers through the sheet, and it was in the back of the head. The ambulance never stopped on the way to Love Field. Air Force One departed Love Field at 2:47 p.m. Central Standard and flew nonstop to Andrews Air Force Base, just south of Washington, D.C. The aircraft arrived at Andrews at 6 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and its wheels were on the blocks at 6:04 p.m. It was a 2-hour and 13-minute trip, well documented by the Air Force One audio tapes and by a logbook retained at Andrews, recovered by the review board. Now, here's an important picture that I want you to take note of. This is a photo of Air Force One taken shortly after its arrival at Andrews Air Force Base. Note the light gray Navy ambulance parked directly next to the airplane. It's a light gray Pontiac cardiac ambulance. It's not a hearse. It was sent to the hospital because of rumors that LBJ had had a heart attack. It ended up transporting the Dallas casket to Bethesda, although that wasn't the original plan. We're about to discuss a very serious chain of custody problem with the president's body, which begins with the arrival of Air Force One at Andrews Air Force Base and ends at 8 o'clock. What happened and what I'm about to describe are a series of 3 different casket entries into Bethesda Naval Hospital. That's right, I just said 3 different casket entries. The time markers for these events, the time of the first casket entry and the time of the third and final casket entry, are critical as we develop our timeline of what was happening to the body that night. The formal autopsy did not begin until shortly after 8 o'clock p.m. So the real question for us to unravel is, what happened to JFK's body between the time of the first casket entry and the time of the third entry? There's 85 minutes in that time span, almost 90 minutes. What was happening to his body during that time period? That's the key to understanding what really happened at Bethesda. That's why we're going to spend so much time on the chain of custody problem. Now, if you look at the photograph on the left, this is the back cover of my book. I wrote a 5-volume book in 2009. The first 4 volumes were about the medical evidence and a lot of the work done by the review board staff. The fifth volume was about the who and the why. So this is the back of volume 1, and you'll see a picture of the Dallas casket, the bronze viewing casket, as it's being taken up the ramp onto Air Force One at Love Field in Dallas. It's very dark brown in color. You can see the side rails on one side of the casket. There are 3 ornate handles covered with expensive wood. There's a viewing lid on the top, which is hinged, opens for public viewings off to one side. And you can see how heavy this casket is. Over 400 pounds empty, and a man inside that weighs almost 185 pounds. So it's a very heavy load, and these agents were struggling, clearly struggling, and they almost dropped it on the way up the airplane. We're going to jump into the chain of custody problem now with both feet. I solicit your attention for the next several slides. We are going to look at autopsy photographs of the president's wounds, and we're going to be comparing how the wounds changed markedly between Parkland and what was observed at Bethesda during the autopsy. But before we get into the photographs, I need everyone to immerse themselves into this chain of custody problem. Those researchers who choose to ignore this problem because it's a little bit complicated, or choose to ignore it because the implications are unpleasant, do so at their own peril. So the title of this slide is, "The Body's Chain of Custody Was Broken en route Bethesda Naval Hospital." Now, the cardiac ambulance that you've seen in the photograph arrived in front of Bethesda Naval Medical Center at 6:55 p.m. per Clint Hill. He was a Secret Service agent, as you all know, in Dealey Plaza, and he wrote a report afterwards, and this is the time he gave for the arrival of the light gray Navy ambulance. The newspaper said it was 6:53 p.m. So those are very consistent times, and we can go to the bank with them. Once it arrived out in front of Bethesda, the ambulance did not move for 12 minutes. That's also from the newspapers. It then followed an FBI car around to the morgue loading dock. More about that later. But President Kennedy's body was actually delivered to the morgue loading dock earlier at 6:35 p.m. That's 1835 hours military time in a black hearse. 20 minutes before the light gray Pontiac cardiac ambulance arrived in front of the hospital. This is worth repeating. President Kennedy's body arrived at the morgue loading dock in the back of the hospital 20 minutes earlier than the light gray ambulance arrived out front, and it arrived in a different car, a black Cadillac hearse, at 6:35 p.m. It arrived in a cheap, lightweight aluminum shipping casket, which was offloaded by a Navy working party in working uniforms led by E6 Navy Corpsman Dennis David. The shipping casket was placed by the sailors in the morgue anteroom. That's the chill box room right outside the morgue proper. And the witnesses to this were Dennis David, one of the members of his working party, Donald Rubentish, who was located years later, Floyd Reeby, another Navy corpsman who was assisting with photography, and Paul O'Connor, one of the 2 Navy corpsmen assisting the autopsy pathologist that night. 20 minutes later, while on his rounds, Dennis David observed the cardiac ambulance at the moment of its arrival in front of Bethesda Naval Hospital. 20 minutes later, after his working party deposited this cheap shipping casket in the morgue anteroom. He's very clear on the sequence. So late that night, Dr. Boswell, one of the 2 Navy autopsy pathologists, confirmed to Dennis David that JFK's body had indeed been inside the shipping casket. This is a very important fact. It's a fact, and we need to determine what it means, and we will be. Now, when the shipping casket was opened shortly after its arrival, President Kennedy's body was wrapped differently than it had been when it left Dallas. Navy Corpsman Paul O'Connor recalled for the HSCA and for numerous researcher interviews that the body was encased in a zippered body bag, and that when the bag was unzipped, JFK's body was nude except for a sheet wrapped around his head. Now, the review board interviewed Gawler's funeral home mortician, John Van Heusen, who was in the morgue that night, and he recalled seeing a black body bag when he was interviewed by us in 1996. There are two key documents which verify this first early casket entry, the first of three casket entries. The first one I'll be talking about is the Boysen report, prepared by United States Marine Corps Sergeant Roger Boysen. And the second will be the Gawler Funeral Home, a document called the First Call Sheet. I know you can't read these two documents on this slide. The point here is just to show you that they do exist and that they're available online at various websites. And now I'll move to the next slide and read you the pertinent excerpts. So the arrival time of the body is confirmed by the Boysen report, and the use of the shipping casket is confirmed by the Gawler's First Call Sheet. Now, looking on the left, Boysen's unit was from the Marine Barracks in Washington, D.C. It provided physical security for the morgue. They showed up early, well before JFK's body, and they reported to Admiral Galloway, the commander of the center. Boysen wrote an after-action report on 26 November 1963, the day after President Kennedy's funeral. He provided an authenticated photocopy of this to the review board in 1997. I interviewed him on the phone. He had an onion skin carbon copy of the report that he typed. He made a photocopy of it, authenticated it on the phone during his interview with me, sent it to me with an attached letter. And the key entry in the report reads like this, quote, "At approximately 1835 hours, the casket was received at the morgue entrance and taken inside," end quote. What this does is it pins a precise time on the recollections of Dennis David. Dennis David, the Navy corpsman, began relating his experiences in 1975 and continued thereafter, essentially that he had met a hearse, a black Cadillac mortuary ambulance at the loading dock, and that he and his working party had unloaded a cheap shipping casket, placed it in the morgue anteroom, and then had been told to depart. They did not see that casket open. 20 minutes later, in the front of the hospital, he saw the light gray Navy ambulance arrive in the front of the hospital. Now, the Gawler's First Call Sheet is a one-page working document which was filled out in this case by three different funeral home employees. It has three different sets of handwriting on it. The key entry on that page is, quote, "Body removed from metal shipping casket at U.S. Naval Hospital at Bethesda," end quote. Now, the word shipping casket has a specific meaning in the funeral trade. It's a cheap metal case, almost always made of aluminum, used to move bodies on airplanes and trains. It's not ornamental, it's not fancy. It's also lightweight, it's not heavy. This was authenticated to the review board by Joe Hagan, the man who was the Gawler's funeral home supervisor that night at the morgue. We interviewed him, and he authenticated the document to us. And in fact, it's his handwriting that mentions the shipping casket. Now, I told you there were three casket entries that night. Let's talk about the second of the three casket entries. On the left, I've summarized what happened during the first entry. Let's move over to the column on the right. The second casket entry occurred at approximately 7:17 p.m. Without going into the details, I will just tell you that that time is inferred from an internal FBI report, an FBI interview of its own agents a couple of years later by Mr. Rosen. It's called the Rosen Report. The second casket entry involved the heavy ornate bronze viewing coffin from Dallas, dark brown metal. Remember, this is in comparison with the lightweight pinkish gray aluminum shipping casket that was offloaded at 6:35. Now, this second entry was handled not by Navy sailors, but by 4 federal agents. 4 agents all by themselves. Secret Service agents Kellerman and Greer, the same 2 men who were in the front of the president's limousine in Dealey Plaza, and FBI agents Seibert and O'Neill. Jim Seibert and Frank O'Neill. All 4 men were wearing business suits and ties, and they removed the heavy Dallas casket from the light gray cardiac ambulance and placed it on a wheeled conveyance called a church truck and moved it into the anteroom outside the morgue. So let's remember, this is 4 federal agents, men in suits, compared to the previous casket entry, which was a working party of sailors. Sailors wearing working uniform, which would have been black trousers and black shirts, or navy blue, if you will, navy blue trousers and navy blue shirts. Totally different set of actors wearing different clothing. Now, the obvious implication of this is that the Dallas casket during this second casket entry had to be empty. There's no way around this. Let's keep moving. This slide's a little busy. I'll highlight the important aspects of it for you. You can go back and revisit it later when the presentation is online. The 2 FBI agents, Seibert and O'Neill, who helped move the Dallas casket on the church truck, were initially not allowed to enter the morgue, and they were sequestered in another location. Now, this quote is from their November 26th FBI FD 302 report. Researchers call it the Seibert-O'Neill report. Quote, a tight security was immediately placed around the autopsy room by the naval facility and the U.S. Secret Service. Bureau agents made contact with Mr. Roy Kellerman, the Assistant Secret Service agent in charge of the White House detail, and advised him of the Bureau's interest in this matter. End quote. This is clearly bureaucratic language indicating that they were not allowed to go into the morgue. And it's written in their report for CYA purposes. Now, many years later, both FBI agents denied to the review board in 1997 that they had been initially barred from the morgue, but this falsehood was contradicted by comments Dr. Humes made. Dr. Humes was the chief pathologist at the autopsy. Comments he made to his close friend, Jim Snyder of CBS. These comments made their way into a January 10th, 1967 internal CBS memo. The memo reads in part, quote, Humes said FBI agents were not in the autopsy room during the autopsy. They were kept in an anteroom, end quote. So part of what the FBI agents said to the review board was untrue. Part of what Humes said to his neighbor, Jim Snyder of CBS, was untrue. Humes said the FBI agents were never in the autopsy room. They were kept in an anteroom. Well, we know that's not true because they were present during the autopsy proper between 8 and 11 o'clock. They took copious notes. They used their notes later to write their after-action report dated November 26th. But the important clue is here that Humes said they were kept outside the morgue in the anteroom. So that's how their visit began. They were initially barred from the morgue. The sensitivity of the FBI agents could be explained by the fact that they were told to, quote, stay with the body and to obtain bullets reportedly in the president's body. That was their job. They admitted that in their FD 302 report. So when researcher David Lifton began to question them about being barred from the morgue before the autopsy started, they closed ranks back in the 1960s and forevermore engaged in denial rather than admit they'd failed to maintain the chain of custody on the body, a key medico-legal concept. If you lose the chain of custody on a body, and these agents knew that, it may invalidate the autopsy report, and it may invalidate any evidence removed from the body or evidence subsequently not found in the body. May be invalidated. So they never wanted to admit what they were hinting at in clear language in their after-action report. Unknown to the two FBI agents at the time, the Dallas casket was empty anyway, and they had never been with the body since Air Force One had landed at Andrews Air Force Base. The Secret Service was hiding this fact from them because I can assure you that Agents Kellerman and Greer, who were on Air Force One for the flight back, they knew it was empty. The FBI agents did not know that. Now, a third casket entry occurred at 8:00 p.m. That's 2000 hours military time per the official after-action report of the military casket team, or honor guard. Let's examine the essential facts of this event before I explain what it means. The 6-man military casket team, or honor guard, was assembled at Andrews Air Force Base before Air Force One landed at 6:00 p.m. It included members of the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Army, the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Marine Corps, and the U.S. Coast Guard. The officer in charge who assembled the team was an Army junior officer, First Lieutenant Samuel Byrd. All members of the casket team wore dress uniforms with white gloves, the dress uniforms of their respective service. They did not wear sidearms or carry guns of any kind, unlike the U.S. Marine Corps security detail from Marine Barracks, which was armed. Now, this honor guard attempted to assist several Secret Service personnel with the confused and uncoordinated unloading of the Dallas casket from Air Force One onto the light gray Navy cardiac ambulance at Andrews Air Force Base. Secret Service agents attempted to push the casket team away from the Dallas casket and prevent them from handling it. And for the most part, they didn't handle it, just one or two members of the team. The Joint Service Casket Team, or honor guard, then flew in a helicopter to a helipad in front of Bethesda Naval Hospital, and they landed about 6:45 p.m., 10 minutes prior to the arrival of the Andrews Air Force Base motorcade. So, concluding my discussion of the third casket entry, I want you to bear with me here. You can come back and examine this slide in detail later. There was an ambulance chase that took place in the dark after the motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base arrived in front of the hospital. Remember, I told you that the motorcade arrived at 6:55 p.m. Everybody got out of the car, people like Jackie Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman, Admiral Berkeley, the president's physician, Secret Service agent Landis. They got out of the car and went in the front door of Bethesda immediately. The only person who stayed in the car was the driver, William Greer, Secret Service agent. 12 minutes later, FBI agents Seibert and O'Neill approached Kennedy aide Lawrence O'Brien at the front of the hospital near the Navy ambulance containing the Dallas casket and asked him why it was still sitting there, motionless. O'Brien told them that the driver, William Greer, did not know where the morgue was located. The two FBI agents told O'Brien, "We know where it is. We get our physicals done here every year, so we know the layout." Seibert and O'Neill returned to their car, and William Greer, driving the gray Navy ambulance, followed them around to the morgue loading dock, more than 12 minutes after Jackie Kennedy had exited the ambulance and entered the front door of the hospital. Meanwhile, the Joint Service Casket Team and a pickup truck had taken off after a decoy ambulance. This is a term not invented by researchers, a term used that night at the scene by General Wheel, who is the military District of Washington commandant. General Wheel told David Lifton in 1967 that a second gray Navy ambulance, the one near the rear of the motorcade, took off first before the Navy ambulance at the front of the motorcade, and that he and Lipsey and a staff car and the casket team and a Navy pickup truck followed the first ambulance to move. His aide, Lieutenant Lipsey, was under the false impression that night that JFK's casket was in the second Navy ambulance at the tail end of the motorcade, and that Jackie Kennedy, at the front of the motorcade, was in a decoy ambulance. An ambulance chase ensued in the darkness, and Wheel and Lipsey, in a staff car, and the casket team, in a Navy pickup truck, attempted to follow the ambulance and got lost. This chase in the darkness was at high speed, and it lasted 10 to 15 minutes. And the casket team actually lost the light gray ambulance in the darkness. It took them 15 minutes, they were lost, remember, to get back to the front of the hospital in a state of profound embarrassment. And as I say here, the term decoy ambulance was used that night by Lieutenant Byrd after consulting with General Wheel about what was going on. Years later, General Wheel's aide, former Army Lieutenant Richard Lipsey, told the HSCA the same thing. He told them there was a decoy ambulance. It was common knowledge, and it was a security measure. So, this third casket entry, the second entry of the Dallas casket, this third entry takes place at 8 o'clock p.m. It's noted in the casket team's after-action report. After the ambulance chase, the casket team discovered an unattended gray Navy ambulance at the morgue loading dock with no casket inside, and they returned to the front of the hospital. Sometime later, shortly before 8 o'clock p.m., the casket team discovered the bronze casket at the front of the hospital in a gray Navy ambulance and followed it around to the morgue loading dock. They proceeded to remove the casket from the light gray ambulance, and they carried it into the morgue at 8 o'clock p.m. Many, many people witnessed this event, and it's recorded in their report. As soon as they entered the morgue, so did a very large audience of over 35 people. Most of them sat in the three-tiered gallery of bleachers. The large audience included the two FBI agents who had been previously barred from entering the morgue, and many of the people in this large audience witnessed the opening of the Dallas casket shortly after 8 o'clock. President Kennedy's body was now inside, and the body was now wrapped in a sheet and the head covered by another sheet, just as it had been wrapped when it left Parkland Hospital in Dallas. So you see what's going on here is a shell game with the president's body. We'll talk about why in just a minute. The autopsy formally began with the first incision, the Y incision on the chest, which was made at 8:15 p.m., per the two FBI agents' report. Let's review the essentials of the three casket entries. Now, later on, after this presentation is online, I know you're going to want to revisit this subject. It's a complex subject, especially the first time you hear it. This is the slide you'll want to come back to and re-examine, slide number 20. I've separated the three casket entries here by time, 6:35, 7:17, and 8 o'clock. By type of casket, the first entry is the cheap aluminum shipping casket with ugly turnbuckles, made of aluminum, no side rails. The second casket entry is the heavy ornate bronze ceremonial coffin from Dallas. The third casket entry is also the heavy ornate bronze ceremonial coffin from Dallas. The difference is who carried these things in. The first casket entry was done by Navy sailors, a working party supervised by Dennis David. The second casket entry was carried out by 4 federal agents, men in suits. The third casket entry was carried out by the military casket team, or honor guard, all wearing dress uniforms and white gloves. JFK's body was not in the Dallas casket for casket entry number 2, but it had been reintroduced into the casket by the time the casket team was allowed to find it, and by the time they took it in at 8 o'clock, JFK's body had been reintroduced into the casket. So here's the summary. The three evolutions are clearly documented as separate events with distinct sets of actors, and the time for each event is distinct and separate from the other two events. The reality of these events cannot be challenged. The task of the researcher is to determine what do they mean. Now, the casket shenanigans began on Air Force One prior to takeoff from Dallas. JFK's body must have been removed from the Dallas casket prior to the swearing in of LBJ, well before the takeoff from Love Field. This inference was made by David Lifton in his 1981 book, Best Evidence, and I support that inference. The body must have been placed in either the forward or after luggage compartment in the hold of the airplane during a documented luggage transfer of luggage from Air Force Two prior to takeoff. This inference was also made by Lifton in Best Evidence, and I support that inference. David Lifton correctly inferred from his discovery of a luggage transfer on the tarmac at Love Field that one or more of the cargo compartments on the underside of Air Force One were open and accessible to ground crew personnel prior to takeoff. Excellent photos taken by researcher James Sawa in the year 2003 of the interiors of the forward and aft baggage holds reveal that while JFK's body could have been placed in either baggage hold, there was probably more room for a body in the aft luggage compartment than in the forward luggage compartment, which was crowded with radio equipment. If JFK's body was removed from the bronze Dallas casket on Air Force One after 2:18 p.m. when it was taken on board, and before 2:30 p.m. when Judge Hughes arrived, Lifton has concluded that it must have been offloaded from the aft galley compartment via the small starboard cargo door in the aft galley using a forklift. Now, Judge Hughes performed the swearing-in of LBJ at 2:38 p.m., and during that ceremony, the casket in the aft galley compartment was guarded by JFK's loyal Air Force aide, Brigadier General Godfrey McHugh. Therefore, I have concluded that the best opportunity for the Secret Service to remove JFK's body from the bronze Dallas casket on board the airplane would have occurred sometime between 2:20 p.m. and 2:30 p.m. Let me explain. As soon as Jackie went on board, immediately after the casket, she sequestered herself in the bedroom. She wanted to compose herself and get away from people. So that would mean that from about 2:20 p.m. until at least 2:30 p.m. when the judge arrived, there was an opportunity for the Secret Service to remove JFK's body from the bronze casket and offload it using a forklift through the aft galley starboard door. So the question is, why would this happen? Why would anybody go to all this trouble for this subterfuge? The reason to me is simple and obvious. The Secret Service feared that County Coroner Earl Rose and the Dallas police might appear at any time and demand a Texas autopsy and demand to take the casket back to Parkland Hospital. So it's now obvious to me that the principal job of the Secret Service, once JFK was dead, was to prevent an honest autopsy in Texas, to get JFK's body to Washington, D.C., where the autopsy results could be manipulated. Now, after takeoff, the Dallas casket was surrounded by Kennedy loyalists conducting an Irish wake and was never opened. Now, these casket shenanigans continued on the ground at Andrews Air Force Base immediately after arrival. Here's what was intended per the Air Force One audio tapes. The newest version of those is called the Clifton tapes. They contain more conversation than the earlier version released by the LBJ Library in the 1970s. It's still an edited tape, but it contains more conversation than the earlier version. What was intended was to use 3 helicopters to transfer the entire Kennedy entourage, including Jackie Kennedy, to the south grounds of the White House. That's on the Air Force One tapes. The Secret Service in the White House Situation Room arranged helicopter transportation to take JFK's body from Andrews Air Force Base to Bethesda Naval Hospital. On the Air Force One tapes, that decision was communicated by the head of the White House detail, Secret Service Agent Jerry Bain. Secret Service Agent Roy Kellerman was told by Gerald Bain, the head of the White House detail, quote, "You accompany the body aboard the helicopter," end quote. That's on the Air Force One tapes. Now, here's what actually happened. I've mentioned the cardiac ambulance that was sent to Andrews by Captain Canada at Bethesda because of rumors that LBJ had had a heart attack. Jackie Kennedy saw the cardiac ambulance on the ground next to the airplane and said to her brother-in-law, Bobby Kennedy, "We'll go in that," destroying a cleverly crafted covert operation. The public and Jackie Kennedy all believed that JFK was in the Dallas casket, but he was not. What we all witnessed on TV was a charade. JFK's body was spirited to Bethesda in a helicopter as soon as LBJ's helicopter departed Andrews Air Force Base for the White House after the TV coverage at Andrews ended. The helo containing JFK's body landed at the Officers Club parking lot, very close to the Bethesda Naval Hospital, at about 1830 hours, about 6:30 p.m. It was met by a Cadillac hearse, a black ambulance, from the Gawler's funeral home. The body was placed in a black zippered body bag and delivered to the morgue loading dock next door in a cheap metal shipping casket at 1835 hours, 6:35 p.m., as documented by the Boysian report. Now, this slide is very busy. I don't want you to recoil in horror. I want you to remember 3 times. You can come back and study this slide later after the presentation is online. I want you to look at the time, 6:14 p.m. Oh, by the way, the purpose of this slide is to demonstrate that there was enough time to transport JFK's body to Bethesda via helicopter by 6:35 p.m. It's important to demonstrate that. That's the arrival time in the Boysian report, but was there enough time to get there? And the answer is yes. So look at the time, 6:14 p.m. That's when LBJ made some brief remarks to the TV audience. The remarks lasted about 45 seconds. He then walked away from the microphone, got on his helicopter called Army 1, and the helicopter warmed up. At 6:20 p.m., the helicopter took off, bound for the south grounds of the White House. We know that that helicopter landed at 6:26 p.m. So that was a 6-minute trip from Andrews to the White House. And I can assure you the pilot was not speeding. We'd already lost one president that day, and that pilot was not about to lose a second president because he was flying too fast. So that's a 6-minute trip. Now, what's important to know is that at 6:21, the television broadcast from Andrews was abruptly terminated. That's 1 minute after Johnson takes off. The broadcast was terminated, and the bright lights were turned out. If we give the people in charge of this transfer, the Secret Service, 2 minutes to get JFK's body out of a cargo hold on SAM 26,000 and into a helicopter earmarked for Bethesda, then I estimate that they left Andrews Air Force Base with JFK's body on board at 6:23 p.m. Paul O'Connor estimated that at about 6:30, he heard a helicopter land at the Oak Club parking lot next door to Bethesda. That would give the helicopter 7 minutes to make that trip. If we give the helicopter, let's say, an additional 2 minutes until 1832 or 6:32, that would make this a 7 to 9 minute trip, 7 to 9 minutes to make this trip. That's spot on. That's entirely feasible because Bethesda Naval Hospital is just north of the Washington, D.C. city limits. It's very close to the White House. Washington's not a very big city. Bethesda's just north of downtown Washington. So there were 7 to 9 minutes allowed for that trip in my timeline, in time for the body to be placed in a shipping casket and driven next door to the morgue loading dock by 6:35. I know you'll want to come back and visit this slide later and study this timeline. So, what's the big picture? What does all this mean? What was the goal of the covert operation at Bethesda Naval Hospital? The goal was to remove all evidence of frontal shots from JFK's body before the autopsy of record began. The people doing this had to expand wounds by post-mortem surgery to obtain access to bullets. Their mission was to remove all metal from the body, to sanitize the crime scene. To the extent possible, they had to obliterate frontal entry wounds. This was their mission. They had to report only shots from behind during the autopsy record in front of the audience, the witnesses in the morgue. They could not report shots from the front. They had to ensure that the official autopsy report, written later, was consistent with the official cover story. One lone shooter firing from above and behind the president's limousine. Now, at the end of this postmortem surgery, the people doing this had to reintroduce JFK's body into the Dallas casket and reunite the military casket team from Andrews with the Dallas casket before the autopsy of record began, creating the appearance of an unbroken chain of custody. So this is what happened at 8 o'clock. JFK's body had been reintroduced into the Dallas casket. The shell game was being played. And as far as the Joint Service Casket Team knew, the only thing wrong was that they had lost track of where the Dallas casket was for many minutes. They did not know that there'd been a shell game going on with the body. They did not know that there were manipulations performed on the body before they found the casket. Okay, continuing right along, slide 25, dramatis personae at Bethesda Naval Hospital. These are the major players involved in the drama at Bethesda on November 22nd, 1963. All three pathologists were all military men, 05 in rank. Commander James J. Humes was the chief prosector. He was the director of laboratories at Bethesda. Commander J. Thornton Boswell, his colleague, was also assisting with the autopsy. He was the director of pathology at Bethesda. Humes' direct subordinate. Lieutenant Colonel Pierre A. Fink was a lieutenant colonel in the Army, and he was the head of the wound ballistics branch at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, co-located with Walter Reed Medical Center. Now, Dr. Fink, who arrived late at 8:30 p.m. and was only assisting Humes and Boswell, was the only forensic pathologist at the autopsy. Humes claimed later that he had done one or two autopsies of death by gunshot, but he was not formally trained as a forensic pathologist. Neither was Dr. Boswell. And certainly doing one or two autopsies of gunshot by death constitutes no practical training whatsoever, really. Now, the commander of the Bethesda Naval Medical Center was Rear Admiral Calvin B. Galloway. Under Galloway were these two Navy captains. Captain Robert Canada, USN, he was the commanding officer of the Bethesda Treatment Hospital, and Captain John Stover was the commanding officer of the Bethesda Naval Medical School, co-located in the same facility. The president's military physician was Rear Admiral George G. Berkeley, and he was present in the Dallas motorcade, at the back of the motorcade, in a bus where he couldn't see anything, but he was in the Dallas motorcade. He did arrive later at Parkland Hospital and witnessed part of the attempts to resuscitate the president. And he was present during large portions of the Bethesda autopsy. Also present at the morgue was Navy Surgeon General Vice Admiral George Kenney. Proof of the plot. Now, Navy Corpsman Paul O'Connor heard a helicopter land at the Oak Club parking lot at approximately 6:30 p.m. About 5 minutes later, he has recalled he recalls agents bringing a shipping casket into the morgue. In 1977, he told the HSCA that JFK was in a pinkish gray shipping casket, in effect, the wrong casket, and that JFK's body was nude and was encased in a body bag, in effect, the wrong wrappings. Medical procedures were performed between 6:35 and 8 o'clock p.m. that were not witnessed by the large audience at the autopsy of record between 8:15 and 11. Wounds were surgically altered. The throat wound was expanded and cranial surgery was performed. Bullet fragments were removed, some large, some small, which have disappeared. Skull X-rays were taken after the postmortem cranial surgery. Many photographs were taken after the wounds were manipulated. featuring a metal head brace not used during the autopsy of record between 8 and 11. Those photos remain in the record today. Skull X-rays and photos in the official record today bear no resemblance whatsoever to the wounds seen in Dallas at Parkland Hospital, as you will soon see. JFK's body was reintroduced into the Dallas casket, as witnessed by a concerned person, Tom Robinson of Gawler Funeral Home. The Dallas bronze casket was damaged when it was taken out to the loading dock. 3 witnesses on the morgue loading dock at 8 o'clock at night for the 3rd casket entry saw damage not seen on Air Force One or at Andrews Air Force Base to the casket. Now, I call Tom Robinson a concerned witness. He told the House Select Committee when he was interviewed in 1977 that, quote, the body was taken, ... and the body never came, ... end quote. So that statement of his is provocative, and it contains ellipses, which probably indicates that there may be something missing from the transcript made by the HSCA staff. The body was taken, and the body never came. Well, this is consistent with the body being reintroduced into the Dallas casket, so it could be found by the Joint Service Casket Team at 8 o'clock. The military casket team, well after the ambulance chase, eventually discovered the bronze Dallas casket sitting in a gray Navy ambulance in front of Bethesda Naval Hospital. Shortly before 8 o'clock p.m., they subsequently followed the gray ambulance and the Dallas casket around to the morgue loading dock at the rear of the hospital, removed the bronze casket from the gray Navy ambulance, and took it inside the building at 8 o'clock p.m. When opened in front of a large morgue audience after 8, JFK's body, I remind you, was wrapped as it had been at Parkland Hospital, with one sheet around the body and another sheet around the head. All the JFK autopsy photos showing the metal head brace, as seen here, were taken between 6:35 and 8 o'clock p.m. How do I know that? I know that because the metal brace was not used during the autopsy of record between 8:15 and 11 o'clock. The use of the head brace, you'll note, conveniently obscures the back of JFK's head. That was very convenient for the people assembling this photographic record. Now, Dr. Humes, the chief prosector, made an excited oral utterance shortly after 8 o'clock p.m. when the head was first unwrapped in front of this large morgue audience of about 35 people. So from the FBI agent's 302 report, they wrote, quote, "It was also apparent that a tracheotomy had been performed as well as surgery of the head area, namely in the top of the skull," end quote. Now, the FBI agents made it clear when they were questioned in 1966 by other FBI officials that these were not their judgments. They were quoting what the chief prosector was saying in the morgue, that there had been surgery of the head area. Paul O'Connor, in interviews, public interviews, indicated what probably happened here. Humes was confronted by a disbelieving audience when the head was unwrapped shortly after 8 o'clock. The wound in the top of the head and the right side and the back was absolutely enormous, bigger than anything you could conceive of being made by one bullet. So the audience, according to O'Connor, gasped and began to rumble. They were very disturbed by what they were looking at. So Humes makes this statement in front of the audience as if to explain what they're looking at, that there's been surgery in the top of the skull. The problem with this is that, of course, we know there was no surgery at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. Now, Agent Seibert confirmed this to the House committee in 1977. that Humes talked about surgery of the head area. Then the HSCA removed it from his draft affidavit in 1978. Seibert responded by refusing to use the HSCA prepared affidavit, typing his own affidavit, and reinserting the statement. I've seen these changes myself. It's really remarkable. Earlier, during the 1960s, the FBI agents had confirmed to FBI officials that they had only placed statements in their report that were verbatim remarks made by the chief autopsy pathologist. So my conclusion is that Humes panicked in front of a large, aroused morgue audience. They refused to accept that the enormity of the damage in the top of JFK's skull was damage done by a bullet. Of course, there was no cranial surgery performed in Dallas. Humes, in my opinion, was engaging in dissociation by noting publicly what the morgue audience was already disturbed about. By doing so, he was suggesting that obviously he could not have been responsible for what was upsetting the audience. It was obvious after 8:00 p.m. that surgery had been performed on JFK's cranium. So Humes was only admitting to the obvious to satisfy the morgue audience in the gallery. This is my interpretation, that Humes performed the surgery. Now, there's clear evidence of postmortem surgery in this photo taken between 6:35 and 8:00. We know that's when it was taken because the metal head brace is used. After 8:00, there was no metal head brace used. A rubberized chalk was used to rest a head on, not this metal head brace. Note the red incision in the forehead above the right eye and the condition of the top of the head. Both are completely different from what was observed in Dallas at Parkland Hospital. Recall the verbal wound descriptions and the wound diagrams of Nurse Bell and Dr. Crenshaw. They bear no resemblance to this. This is not an occipital parietal wound. This wound is in the top of the head. It's largely in the parietal region and partly in the frontal region. Now, this is how President Kennedy's appearance was when the body arrived at 6:35 p.m. prior to post-mortem surgery. A new witness surfaced in 2010 when he contacted me. His name was Quentin Schwen. He explained that he had been a photographic student at Rochester Institute of Technology in the early 1980s, where one of his professors, his academic advisor, had previously worked on the House Select Committee on Assassinations, had been one of the two men who analyzed the backyard photographs of Oswald. So his professor knew that Schwen had an interest in the assassination. Schwen later conducted a job interview with a federal official who showed up at RIT and showed him numerous photographs, some of them aerial or satellite photographs of airplanes on the ground, asking Schwen how he would determine how long the airplanes were, what the wingspan was, how would he use the shadows in the picture. But the agent also showed Schwen a color-positive transparency that looked like this. I spent 3 years evaluating Schwen's credibility, and I've decided, after viewing his sealed transcript, proving that he attended RIT, and evaluating other aspects of his story, that he is 100% truthful about this. So I encouraged him to have a medical artist draw a rendition under his supervision of the color-positive transparency that he witnessed during this strange job interview in 1981. You'll notice that the top of the head is not gone. According to Schwen, there was some slight disruption above Kennedy's right ear. So on the left of this picture, above Kennedy's right ear, you see a dark area. That's where there was some clear disruption right underneath the scalp. And he remembers a small entrance wound high in the forehead above the right eye, which was pink in color. It looked like bubble gum. And the throat wound was certainly not a gash. It was two intersecting lines, 90 degrees apart, not very wide at all. with the corners slightly folded back. This concurs with the recollections of photos seen by Dennis David and Joe O'Donnell. Joe O'Donnell was a USIA White House photographer who was shown images that looked very much like this by White House photographer Robert Knudsen. I write about him in my book, about both of them. Dennis David was shown photographs that looked like this by William Pitzer, the head of the audiovisual department at Bethesda, about a week after the assassination. So I showed this image to Dennis David before he died, and he confirmed that this looks very much like the photographs he remembers seeing, shown to him by Pitzer, almost identical, particularly the top of the head and the small entry wound in the top of the forehead. They look identical with what he recalls seeing in images that never made it into the official record. So this is what Kennedy looked like from the front when he arrived from Dallas. Now, look at the image I just showed you on the right, so-called autopsy photograph, which was really taken before 8 o'clock, before the autopsy record started. Look at the differences between that image and the medical diagram commissioned by Quentin Schwen, based on his memory of the color positive transparency. The entrance wound high in the forehead above the right eye has been removed, excised with a bright red incision. And the top of the head has been dramatically opened up. The top of the head was not opened up when the body arrived at Bethesda, as shown by the diagram on the left. But it certainly is in this photograph taken before 8 o'clock. Now, this is a wound diagram made for the review board staff by Tom Robinson. Tom Robinson was one of the morticians on the staff of Gawler Funeral Home. This is further proof that JFK's body arrived at Bethesda with the same head wound seen in Dallas. Tom Robinson drew a sketch very much like this for the House Committee in 1977, except he drew it freehand on a blank sheet of paper. So we wanted him to draw the wound he recalled seeing when he first saw the president on an anatomical template from Grant's Anatomy. So he did that. He drew a hole in the occipital region of the skull. Now, his hole is centerline. It's not off to the right, but it is in the back of the head. It's not in the top of the head. It's not on the right side of the head. And so this confirms that Kennedy arrived at Bethesda, confirms for me, with the same wound he had when he left Dallas. There were two other people who confirmed this for me. One is Captain Canada, the head of the treatment hospital, who told researcher Michael Kurtz in 1968 that President Kennedy had an avulsed, exploded exit wound in the rear of his head. And when he was challenged about this by researcher Kurtz, that this was at variance with the autopsy report, Captain Canada told him at the time, well, of course, that's part of the cover-up, and I don't want you to publish this recollection of mine until 25 years after my death. So fortunately, Michael Kurtz did publish this recollection of Dr. Canada, which confirms this drawing. He published it in 2006 in his book, The Assassination Debates. And then Dr. Ebersol, the radiologist at the autopsy, testified to the House Select Committee that President Kennedy had a large occipital wound in the back of his head, and that later a piece of bone produced at the autopsy was from the occipital region of the skull. Now, we asked Tom Robinson in regard to this drawing, what are the dotted lines in the picture? He said they indicated saw cuts, post-mortem surgery to remove JFK's brain. So in his 1977 HSCA interview, Robinson made clear that he witnessed the pathologist saw the skull open and remove JFK's brain. Robinson's drawing at the right for the review board indicates where the saw cuts were made. I call this a modified craniotomy. It's not the normal way a craniotomy, a skull cap removal, is performed, but it was sufficient to get access to the brain. Witnesses at the autopsy proper between 8 and 11 did not see Humes perform a craniotomy, and Humes denied doing so to the Warren Commission. And yet he told the ARRB under oath that he did. Very matter-of-factly told us that he did perform a craniotomy. But nobody saw a craniotomy performed between 8 and 11 o'clock when the autopsy proper was performed. So that tells me that Tom Robinson was witnessing postmortem surgery between 6:35 and 8 o'clock. When Tom Robinson looked at this autopsy photograph, he frowned and became extremely disturbed. And in his own way, he's a country boy from Maryland, he said, well, that makes it look like that's what the bullet did. And he shook his head left, right, and he said, that's what the doctors did, not what the bullet did. So I'm going to repeat what he told us in 1996. That's what the doctors did, not what the bullet did. So this is Tom Robinson confirming postmortem surgery with his ARRB interview, just as he did with his diagram. There are two direct witnesses to postmortem surgery at Bethesda Naval Hospital. One is the aforementioned mortician, Tom Robinson. He saw JFK's skull sawed open to remove the brain prior to 8 o'clock. He saw the brain surgically removed by the pathologist. We'll be talking about that in a minute. And these are the sources, HSCA, ARRB. Another witness to postmortem surgery was X-ray technician Ed Reed. There were two enlisted men who took the skull X-rays and the other X-rays, Ed Reed and his supervisor, Gerald Custer. Reed told us under oath in 1997 that he witnessed Dr. Humes cut the scalp high in the frontal bone, way up high above your forehead, just above the hairline, with a horizontal scalpel cut. So in this image, that scalpel cut would be left to right after the hair begins. He then saw the scalp retracted from front to back, and he witnessed Dr. Humes cut into the underlying cranial bone with a mechanical circular bone saw. At that point, he and Custer were summarily dismissed. Get the hell out of here. What are you doing in the morgue? Get out of here. If you analyze their testimony, it's clear that they were recalled a short time later, 15 to 20 to 30 minutes later, and then they took the skull X-rays after this manipulation was performed. So these next four slides are extremely important. They are a bit busy. Don't panic. I'm going to walk you through these slides. They're extremely important to this presentation. JFK's brain was removed during postmortem surgery to sanitize the crime scene by removing all visible metal from the brain and bullet tracks in the brain tissue. So look, you need to understand that there were two Navy corpsmen who assisted the three pathologists with the autopsy, James Jenkins and Paul O'Connor. They were crucial witnesses who help us understand what took place prior to 8 o'clock p.m. at Bethesda Naval Hospital by describing what they saw after 8 o'clock. What they saw and did not see after 8 o'clock is vital to understanding the flow of events that evening. So bear with me and let's walk through this one step at a time. Now, Navy Corpsman James Jenkins, after 8 o'clock p.m., witnessed Dr. Humes publicly remove the brain before a large Bethesda morgue audience. These recollections of his all come from two late-night appearances he made in Dallas in 2013 on the 50th anniversary from meticulous notes taken by Dr. David Mantic. I trust Dr. Mantic implicitly to take accurate notes. So let's just start here. No craniotomy, no skull cap removal was performed between 8 and 11. Neither James Jenkins nor Paul O'Connor witnessed a craniotomy at the autopsy proper. But Tom Robinson and Ed Reed did prior to 8 o'clock during clandestine surgery. I just told you about that. They both saw extensive cutting on the calvarium, and while it was not a traditional skull cap removal, it was sufficient to provide access to the brain. While Reed was summarily ordered to leave the morgue after Humes commenced the postmortem surgery, Robinson, who was a mere mortician and therefore a non-entity as far as Humes was concerned, he was allowed to stay and actually witness the brain removed as well. Jenkins has opined that there was much more damage to the scalp and skull than the damage to the brain would have suggested. Much more damage to the scalp and skull than the damage to the brain would have suggested. Well, this damage is the postmortem surgery. Let's continue. James Jenkins, after 8 o'clock p.m., witnessed Dr. Humes publicly remove JFK's brain before a large Bethesda morgue audience. James Jenkins clearly recalls Dr. Humes' excited oral utterance. Quote, "This brain has fallen out in my hands," end quote. James Jenkins concluded in 2013 at a Dallas symposium that no cutting was required to remove JFK's brain because it had been previously removed from JFK's cranium. He speculated that the purpose for doing this would have been to remove bullet fragments. JFK's brain appeared to Jenkins to be too small for his cranium. My conclusion is that this was likely due to extreme dehydration. After all, it was 7.5 hours after death, plus extensive tissue loss, both from bullets and from postmortem surgery. Jenkins' firm opinion in 2013 was that the brain removed from JFK's cranium did not match the HSCA drawing of a brain photo in the National Archives. More on this later. James Jenkins told Dr. David Mantic and Dr. Gary Aguilar in 2013 that the brain he saw removed at the autopsy had much more extensive tissue loss in the posterior region of the brain, in the back of the brain, than in the HSCA drawing made from a brain photograph in the archives. We'll be looking at this HSCA drawing later in this presentation. Once again, he examined the drawing made from a brain photograph in the archives and said it did not match the brain removed from JFK's cranium and handed to him by Dr. Humes to infuse. James Jenkins received and infused JFK's brain in the morgue after he witnessed its public removal by Dr. Humes after 8 o'clock p.m. The preservation technique using 10% formalin solution, or formaldehyde, was called perfusion by former AFIP neuropathologist Dr. Dick Davis. I interviewed Dr. Dick Davis in 1997. This technique involved both injection drip, or infusion, and soaking afterwards while fully immersed. That's called exfusion. Jenkins noticed that the internal carotid arteries in the brain's underside were severely shriveled and retracted, and thus difficult to infuse, unlike the condition of most recently removed brains. The brainstem had already been cut when Dr. Humes removed the brain, in 2 different planes on each side of the brainstem, when Humes removed it and relinquished it to Jenkins. This explains how he could witness Humes remove the brain without doing any cutting to free it. It is worth repeating here that Jenkins expressed a definite conclusion in 2013 during the JFK conference at the Adolphus Hotel in Dallas that the brain Humes extracted from JFK's cranium in front of Jenkins and a large morgue audience had already been removed previously, probably in order to remove bullet fragments. Now, here's the last of these 4 busy slides. Let's conclude by making some important points. The 3 existing JFK Skull X-Rays show that JFK's brain was definitely still in the cranium when the Skull X-Rays were taken, but that there was considerable tissue loss from the forebrain, both the left and right of the forebrain, and from the right cerebral hemisphere. This is confirmed by optical density measurements, which Dr. Mantic will talk about in 2 weeks, and by visual observation using a hot light by qualified medical personnel who have examined the skull X-rays in the archives. So my conclusion is that much of this tissue loss in the forebrain and on the right side of the brain was the result of clandestine postmortem surgery between 6:35 p.m. and 8 o'clock p.m., not bullet blast. Certainly some was the result of bullet blast, but most of it is the result of surgery to remove metal from the brain and bullet tracks from brain tissue. Now, Navy Corpsman Paul O'Connor's oft-repeated assertion, timed to 8 o'clock in his memory, that, quote, there was no brain in the cranium, end quote, was likely a hastily made subjective interpretation error based on the large amount of brain tissue missing from the forebrain and the right cerebral hemisphere. After all, there was a brain in the cranium. Jenkins received it from Dr. Humes and infused it that night. So O'Connor simply made a mistake, a subjective interpretation error, based on the first dramatic sight he had when the scalp flaps were retracted and he saw that there was a lot of brain tissue missing inside the cranium. It's clearly just an exaggeration on his part. My conclusion is that neither Jenkins nor O'Connor was present in the morgue during the clandestine postmortem surgery, conducted well before 8 o'clock p.m. to sanitize the crime scene. Neither man witnessed or conducted a craniotomy, whereas it was normally their job to do so at Bethesda autopsies. Paul O'Connor was certainly present when the shipping casket arrived earlier, but he told the HSCA that he was ordered out of the morgue for up to 40 minutes at one point. Per Tom Robinson and Ed Reed, Dr. Humes did perform a modified craniotomy of sorts. But since neither Jenkins nor O'Connor recalled that, I conclude that they were not present in the morgue during most of the period between 6:35 and 8. They witnessed only what the large morgue audience witnessed after 8 o'clock. The one exception was Paul O'Connor, who did witness the early arrival of the shipping casket and the removal and opening of the body bag found inside the shipping casket, before he was dismissed from the morgue and placed under guard by a member of the Marine security detail. Okay, this is the end of part one. You can stop this and proceed to part two of my recording.